Welcome to the Futurist Society podcast, where we delve into the latest advancements in technology, science, and culture. From discussions on the latest breakthroughs in AI, biotechnology, and space exploration, the Futurist Society is your window into all of the awesomeness that the future holds. Get ready to be informed and inspired as we consider the positive impact of emerging technologies on humanity. Without further ado, welcome your host, Dr. Awesome.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Futurist Society, where, as always, I am your host, Dr. Awesome. Today, we are talking in the present, but talking about the future with Dr. Stephen Coleman, who is a molecular biologist, but has really done a lot of work on the field of horses and all the different things that science affects those animals. So thanks for being with us, Stephen. Realistically, when I was introduced to you, I was reading an article about a horse that had sold for $2 million at auction. And I was like, what? I didn't even know that that was something that was available. I know that in certain circles, these are really beautiful and amazing animals that have a lot of science that goes into making them like that. So I'm really interested to talk to you about how that science affects them and probably animals at large, because I know that a lot of people have, like myself, pets at home that they're probably interested in all the different science that's happening to them. But tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into this field, as well as the work that you're doing right now.
All right. Well, no, and thank you very much for inviting me to join you. As an undergraduate, was in a major at the University of Kentucky called agricultural biotechnology, and that was all about the application of genetics and, recombinant DNA technology in plants and animals. The University of Kentucky had one of the first programs of that nature, and I, went there, or was attracted to go there for that reason. Got to get into all of this stuff about genetics and all of these cool things that we were learning to be able to do. So that got me into that, and really the molecular side of genetics. As part of that program, we have to do a research project, sort of in our senior capstone experience for that major was to do that. And I had no real idea what I was going to do for that. There was a lot of options at the university. A lot of my, fellow students would go to the med school, work with researchers and scientists there. That was kind of interesting, but maybe not, might not have lit the fire way down deep. But my dad is a professor at the University of Kentucky, and he's been into horses his entire life. And there's a researcher at the University of Kentucky named Ernie Bailey, who sort of initiated a lot of this work, or had been at the forefront of a lot of work in genetics in the horse. And so I ended up going to work in his lab, started with a small project to map some genes using one of the maps for the horse genome. And that kind of got me into the horse side of things. We moved to Kentucky from Canada. One of my first experiences is kind of funny. You're talking about reading about the horse that sold for $2 million. And that's a kind of a middle of the road price for a lot of the racehorses in Kentucky. We got to go to one of the first falls we were there in Kentucky. We went to the yearling sales at Keeneland, and we're sitting there with, ended up sitting right near a person that bought a horse for $4 million. And so you're like, yeah, wow. That's kind of an interesting to sort of be there and watch it live. But yeah, it's kind of amazing.
Maybe my number of digits was off, but I just remember reading it and I was like, I cannot believe there's so much money in just buying an animal. But anyway,
it's a lot of money to put in and think, a lot of money to invest in something that may or may not pay off. In some ways, it might be the ultimate, optimistic view of the future, is you're buying this, horse, and for racing, that's never been, it will have never been raced when some people buy it for that much money, right? They're hoping that it's going to go and perform as a racehorse, and then, ultimately be used for, if it's a male horse, you're hoping to send it to stud so you can make more horses and, convince other people to make the same bet that you did.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to was at the University of Kentucky for all of my training, did my undergrad there, stayed and worked with another researcher named Jamie McLeod. Our lab there did musculoskeletal research, but I got involved with Jamie because he was building a tool called a microarray, which is a tool that allows us to look at gene expression across a large number of targets.
Yeah.
And
We
this
use it in my field for like craniofacial disorders. Like it's like a quick test to make sure that a child doesn't have a certain set of genes that would
yeah,
predispose.
and it that's the really brilliant application of them now is, at the time where we didn't know anything about the horse genome, but Dr. McLeod had developed these tools or was developing this tool, and at the time it was pretty brand new for the horse, but it came with a whole bunch of problems and questions, right? Like, how do we know what genes that the markers we have on our microarray are? So, I got into that not because I knew, I think, anything about it, but I wasn't afraid to, the computer side of things. And so my work, my training has very much been in the molecular biology side of it and the application of computers or bioinformatics to that as well. Ended up being in the right place at the right time. We were one of the first groups to use next generation sequencing, which is sort of for the research side, and really, that, like you said, cutting edge, bleeding edge kind of stuff is where we're able to look at profile all of the expression in a tissue or a sample. But we were one of the first to get to do that and got us involved. And so, I jokingly say my claim to fame is that I was one of many researchers that got to be involved with the sequencing and publication of the equine genome, which was cool to be involved with. And
Yeah.
came to Colorado State University, worked in a lab associated with the vet school, with Carol and Jeff Willis, and that was all on RNA biology. So what happens, spent a lot of time learning about how to make the different parts of, different genes and how they're expressed, but then what do you do with them after they're made? And then my lab now has sort of come to where we're trying to apply those things and those skills that I learned, but to understand more about how homeostasis or balance is achieved in the gastrointestinal tract. So we're looking at the interaction between like the microbiome and the various microorganisms that live in there. How do they interact with the horse or just the host? The horse is our model for a horse or for a host right now.
I feel like that's another thing that I was interested in talking to you about, because when I think about the really popular stuff that's happening in molecular genetics right now, the microbiome is one of them, genetics is one of them, longevity, just human performance is one of them. Are you guys having any sort of like breakthroughs that are translating to horses being better at running, or any of the tools that they're used for?
I think there's the microbiome is a crazy little like place to go into, because it's right now in humans and horses, in all of it, right? It's this, because there's so much more left to learn about it, which is exciting, but so much of it is unknown. So it's a little bit like it's a magic bullet almost, right? It's like, well, the microbiome is going to do all of these things. And I don't know if we know that yet, but it's exciting to look into that. We know that there are changes in the microbiome associated with training, right? So there are groups that have sort of looked at in horses, but in other species. So as you do more training, there's a shift in what the different compositions of the microbiome might look like. That could be an interesting potential tool, is can we manipulate that? And sort of, if we start to push your microbiome or a horse's microbiome in the direction of what a really athletic individual's looks like, can we help support improved performance in someone that hasn't, or an animal that hasn't been trained yet, right? So that may make the training more effective. Maybe it makes it a little bit more rapid, right? So we could potentially get a horse from untrained to trained much quicker, right? There's one of the places, microbiome and the brain, right? The gut brain axis is a big thing. And that may be, from a trainability standpoint for horses, may be a really important place is, can we manipulate what's happening in the gut to improve, make a horse more, help
Mhm.
a horse be more trainable, or that it takes less, time and effort. And that's better for the horse, better for the people.
Yeah. So what are like the preliminary results with that? Like, because that's something that I'm looking into myself, like independently. There's all of these companies out there that are selling probiotics, different strains that increase testosterone or, you know, increase like the absorption of nutrients
Mhm.
or decrease the absorption of nutrients. Like they allow for less carbohydrates. So I'm experimenting with that myself, but I mean, there's no real definitive data for humans, right? Do you guys have any of that for horses at all?
Unfortunately not. I think the approach that we have taken is trying to underwrite. So probiotics, prebiotics, all of that sort of stuff are really exciting, but they don't have long-term ability to, right? They've never been demonstrated to have long-term ability to change what our microbiomes look like, right? So you can go and buy that supplement, buy the pill or whatever and take it. And, if we were monitoring, we would see that those cultures or those strains show up in your microbiome or in the horse's microbiome. But the moment you stop taking them, they're gone, right? Like they will clear. And I think some of it, the approach or the idea that we have about that is shifting, right? So it used to be, if you look at publications from 5, 10 years ago about the microbiome, they would say things like the most important factors for determining that are diet, environment, all of these external factors. And there's even papers that conclude and say genetics has no impact on, right? They're like, genetics has very little impact on us because they didn't see heritability in terms of strains that might exist or whatever. And that never made sense to me because it wouldn't be from a evolutionary standpoint, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to leave that something that seems to be so critical to our systems entirely to whatever was the external, right?
Mm.
We focused on a paper from now, I think almost 8 years ago, but they did a really interesting experiment looking at how these non-coding RNAs from the host have a role in sort of managing. I always describe the microbiome as like a party. So who gets to come, right? Who gets to
Mm.
come to the party? Who gets to stay?
Right.
If you start causing problems, I imagine you're right. There's the party itself regulates it, but whoever's hosting the party is also regulating that.
Right. Yeah. Bouncer, if you will.
The bouncer, and we sort of focused on, so I wonder if that is a bouncer, we really got focused on it. So we started out looking at the microbiome and I had a graduate student and we looked, and the horse is a great model, I think, for looking at the microbiome because the horse relies so much on it.
Mm.
So we are autoenzyme digesters, so we process most of what we eat with enzymes that we produce.
Mm.
Um, but we still have some fermentation that occurs in our large intestine. And
Mm.
we get 10, 15% of our energy and sort of nutrients from that process that happens in what I will probably default to calling the hind gut, because
Mm.
that's how we refer to it in the horse.
Mm.
Horses get like 80% of their energy and nutrient, right? A lot of their energy, particularly, but also some important nutrients from fermentation that happens in the hindgut that microbes are responsible for. And
Mm.
so horses are really connected to it. So it makes a really nice system because changes are going to have a strong influence on how that horse performs and just does normal digestion. I had a student that looked, so we had done, and we weren't the first to do it, but looked at the composition of communities in different parts of the hindgut. So the horse is also like the hindgut of a horse particularly is kind of like a balloon animal. It's a
Mhm.
lot of like big compartments that are kind of floppy and that turns around on itself, and massively long intestinal tract packed into a very small space. And so, but I had the student Kaylee, and she looked at different spots, and there were dramatic differences in the communities.
Hmm.
One of the places that there was this really dramatic difference was in the what's called the ventral colon and the dorsal colon. So the horses comes out of this cecum, which is a really well-developed chamber for fermentation, and it finishes in the ventral colon. It goes through a structure called the pelvic flexure, which is ironically right near the pelvis, but it's a 180-degree turn in the intestinal tract. And before and after that structure, the populations were very, very different. And that got us really thinking about, like, that's interesting in understanding how these two, or how the horse and the microbiome are interacting with each other, because things aren't supposed to stop at the pelvic flexure. If they do, it results in an impaction, and in horses, that's a colic. And colics are can be devastating to horses. If there's a surgical solution, that's a $10,000 to $15,000 cost that the owner will incur, and it's not a guarantee that they're going to even save their horse as a result. One of my associated responsibilities at CSU is I'm the faculty advisor for our polo teams. And so we had a polo horse that colic just this last weekend, and fortunately we were able to resolve it medically, just with IV fluids and some other stuff. But that's still a $3,000 or $4,000 charge, all because of impaction. So we wanted to know what's keeping certain bacteria on one side of this flexure and not on the other side. And so that's where we got into looking at gene expression in the different tissues, both protein coding, but also looking at these non-coding transcripts, because I think that's really going to be a key part in terms of how the two things interact. But then that gives us a future outcome, is if we can start to understand how the horse manages its microbiome, that's something that's potentially manipulated, right? We might be able to manipulate that either with some sort of.
That's what I'm most interested in, because I feel like, so one of the surprises for me was just the amount, like the entire ecosystem. It's just not something that I was familiar with. Like when I saw that this horse sold for that amount of money, I did like a deep dive into, you mentioned polo, like there's so much money in polo, right? You have to make sure that this animal performs at the highest level, right? And so you're talking about supplementation. I feel like, there's this stigma or whatever for supplementation and experimentation for humans in sports, right? Like one of I think it was like the Oracle founder just recently proposed the idea of making like an Olympics just for people that take like all steroids and like everything. And I granted, I think that that's like a very unnatural way to play sports, but I feel like if anybody's doing it, it must be in like these animal sports, right? Like if anybody's supplementing, if everybody's trying to maximize the animal as best they can, I feel like it's a little bit more morally palatable for that to happen in animal sports. So what are people doing? Like what is allowed, what is not allowed? Because I feel like right now, especially in molecular genetics, people are just dipping their toes in altering their microbiome, the way that they, their diet. Honestly, even genetics. Like they just came out with a sickle cell treatment that cures people of sickle cell, and it's like a genetic editing tool. So that people are manipulating their genetics too. So we have the technology, right, to manipulate all these different facets of physiology. How is it happening in the horse world? Because I feel like A, there's so much money in it, and B, we're dealing with animals. So, I feel like it's a little bit more morally gray.
Almost, yeah. That's a good description of it. So there's lots of, it's the right way to go. Supplementation is a big thing, right? There's a giant market for all of these things. This supplement's going to do this is going to do that, right? This feed, this formulation, right? So, and those are all right. A lot of those are based very much in science. I have colleagues here, um, are she's been here for about a year, Devin Catalano. She, worked for a feed company and developed, used her training as a nutritionist and to develop feeds. And uh, she likes to point out, there are some very high performing horses that have been on her, those supplement, on her formulations. But then, you'll have companies that say, this will do this will do that. We give horses, supplements that, for show horses that make their hair look nice and their feet shiny. And, some of the supplements are, you can paint on, nail polish for horses so that they look, their feet are shiny. Um, you know, Racing is a big, and performance areas are a big place where you will see supplementation, and there are allowed supplements and there are disallowed supplements and different things that you can add. And that's going to be the challenge with that in horses, is that different places have different rules associated with it, right? So one that there's a condition that exists in horses, the exact occurrence I don't know off the top of my head, but it's called EIPH. So it's exercise induced. I'm going to say, I always think of it as exercise induced pulmonary hypertension. It's not the right word, but EIPH, what happens in these horses, if they have it, is their blood pressure goes up as they're exercising, and it can cause sort of leakage through some of their membranes. And so they'll bleed out of their noses. And that's not a design, right? That obviously has some potential impacts on performance. And so in lots of environments, you'll have a drug given called Lasix, which does exactly what it lowers blood pressure preemptively, so that when the blood pressure goes up, it doesn't get to a point where it's going to go over. That is widely appropriate in lots of places and allowed. And then other places, they've decided that it might be masking a dangerous condition. And so I think like New York may have made that illegal for racehorses. So if you're running your horse in New York, you can't use Lasix, but in Colorado you could, or Kentucky you could. And that's, different places. There are some things that you can give, medications that you can give, that are really useful for, treating certain conditions. Erythropoietin is one, right? If you need to increase blood cell volume.
Right. Doping, like in cycling, it's what Lance Armstrong got busted with.
Yeah, and that's what it is, right? But that's also, so you can't have that certain, right? If you're going to give that, you have to stop it before a performance event and stuff like that. One of the things that, is likely coming, and you mentioned it with the different gene editing technologies, is the idea that you could do gene doping. And so if you could alter the DNA of your horse, insert, potentially alter, go from one set of alleles to a different one, and those new alleles may have, positive impacts on performance. The one limitation at this point is our knowledge of what you might want to change is still, we know so much about so many things, but what's left to know is still,
pretty vast.
What we don't know would fill, the Encyclopedia Britannica.
Yeah. No, I think that that's something that we're just kind of dipping our toes in with human beings. And I guess I assumed that there would be more progress in animals, just because animal models are like the first stage, right? And so, like for example, like there's like a gene that affects myoglobin in humans, and there's like talks of like that being a potential target for people who want to build muscle, right? And I don't know if that analogy exists in horses in such a way that these people are, having the ability to do something like that.
I know there's somewhere. So one of the genes that people focus on a lot is one called myostatin. Myostatin is a negative regulator of
Yeah.
muscle growth, and
Mhm.
it has some impact on the muscle fiber type. So fast
Yeah.
twitches, slow twitch.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think that that's actually what I meant to say. Myostatin, not
no,
low.
well, and yeah, so myostatin, there's a mutation in cattle of myostatin that produces what are called double muscled cattle. And
Yeah,
so double muscled cattle, they look like Popeye after he's taken spinach, right? Like
yeah,
they're all sorts of
yeah,
muscle.
yeah.
Um, so in horses, the interesting connection that they found of that gene is there's a SNP in one of the introns of this gene, and depending on which genotype they have, it associated with, or there was the CC genotype was associated with short distance performance. So, quarter horses had this. So quarter horses run a quarter mile. Um, and then if you looked at sort of longer distance thoroughbreds or Arabian horses, they would have the alternate allele, which was TT. Um, and then horses that sort of ran mid distance had a heterozygous genotype. So they had a T and a C. Uh, and that was kind of cool because it really kind of felt out, right? That's more probably a product of, at least my opinion of it is that that's more a product of our selection of those different, right? We've selected horses to run short distances and we've selected horses to run longer distances, and that's probably why the association is so clear. But there's a lot of focus on that, and even to the point that there's concern that that would be a target for gene doping in horses, is that you would, you know, let's say you wanted to run short distances, but the horse you had the TT genotype, you could use the gene editing tools. And the most modern one is something called CRISPR-Cas9, which is a
Mhm.
really not, it's really effective at targeting certain places, that you would use that to alter, you know, make the TT genotype a CC genotype. Boom, suddenly your horse may, the timing of it would be really important. You need to do that before all the muscles develop. But, you know, you could influence the genetics of your horse in a non sort of selective breeding approach. Maybe you make faster progress. Is that entirely wrong? I don't, you know,
Well, I mean, I don't know.
I don't know.
Currently, I'm not I feel like I'm not a bioethicist. Like I'm not really interested so much in like the morality of it. I feel like I'm just interested in the fact that this is possible. I mean, for literally millennia, human beings have been trying to select specific genes in horses, select outcomes in horses to give them some sort of desired trait, right? I mean, like you just said, it's selective breeding is what we've been using, and for some reason, like that's okay. Whereas like, really selective breeding of using CRISPR is not okay, right? Like, so I'm not here to like weigh in on, like the morality of it, but I just think it's interesting that we're here, right? Like we have the genetic capability to do something like that, but also just like the possibilities, right? Like I didn't know that this gene existed and that like you might be able to turn it on and off, and maybe we could have horses that just like run forever. It's an animal that's so ingrained in human culture.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't really personally, like I live in the city, so I'm not around horses a lot. I know Kentucky is horse country, and that's something that you're probably closer to. But for a lot of people, they look at horses as something that it just doesn't affect their daily life. But for a lot of people in the world, it's something that affects their daily life. And honestly, the whole sport around it, like it's just something that I wasn't even familiar with, right? Like polo, horse racing, all this stuff. Like there's just like so much big money in these things. And I'm sure that some of that is trickling down into scientific investment to make horses more perform better, right?
The irony is, I think in some ways, yes, and in
Mhm.
other ways, not as much as you think. I think the last, the myostatin thing and altering that, I think there's that potential for sure. I think the real value for horses and for us is not necessarily to do it from a perspective of say, oh, I want to enhance performance, but we know, there's a lot of diseases that have a genetic component or even a genetic, their etiology goes back to a genetic cause.
Mm.
And those would be the things I think that would be valuable to address, because those are the things that might even limit a lot of, performance genetics,
Mm. Mm.
in quarter horses, there's a number of mutations associated with, muscle function. One that's big is called HYPP. It's
Mm.
a hyperkalemic periodic paralysis,
Mm.
and it's a mutation in a sodium gated ion channel in the muscles. So it prevents them from closing, and so it prevents the muscles from relaxing after a contraction. And humans actually have the same a mutation in the same gene, different mutation, same gene, same result. So there's these kids that by the time they're 5, they look like Arnold Schwarzenegger because their muscles are doing this sort of like isometric, right? They're contracted all the time, and so the response there is to build muscle, and that is an issue in horses, and it worked out really well for halter show horses, these horses that were heterozygotes, so they had one copy of the mutation and one regular copy, they would have increased muscle tone. And so they would actually, be selected. And there was a number of studies that showed that if you had that mutation, were more likely to win versus not. But now, because of the negative impacts, you are less likely to breed a horse that has HYPP.
Mm.
But those horses may have other really good performance genetics associated with them, but the HYPP is keeping them from getting that. So if you could deal with, right, if you could alter HYPP so that they don't have that, now you could access that. There's another condition called HERDA, which relates to skin. Their skin's really stretchy. It's very similar to something called Ehlers-Danlos
Ehlers-Danlos, yeah.
syndrome in humans.
Yep.
That was
Ehlers.
actually one of the causes they originally investigated for this. It's genetically different, but again, there's a lot of really great cutting horses
Mhm.
that people may want to be able to access the genetics of, but they're kind of, hesitant because they may carry HERDA. And so again, if you could address that, that'd be I think, an interesting place to go with that,
Yeah,
both for horses and humans.
absolutely. That's
The
something I always thought of as like the next logical step for genetics is like, let's screen all of the bad and then just fix the bad, I mean, obviously you can tell science fiction is a big influence in my life. It's what brought me to do this podcast and makes me always thinking about like the next generation. But that was like one of the it's one of like the origin stories for Superman, right? Where like, the Kryptonians they just like selected out all the bad and everything that they were left with was like this perfect human being. And I think that's like a realistic starting point for genetic editing, because you're right, a lot of morally gray area with genetic editing in general, especially as you get older and you want to start making modifications that may seem a little bit unfair. But if we start all at the same baseline, right? If we say, okay, like this is the model such that everybody should be able to not have paralysis. Everybody should be able to, not be blind, right? Because of some sort of genetic blindness. Everybody has like a symmetrical face that, they're not born with some sort of craniofacial syndrome that causes them to have a difficulty speaking or chewing or swallowing. I think that would be something that would be an interesting future. And like maybe that's something that exists for horses, because horses, right, like especially in the developing world, I mean, they're important for production, they're important for like people's livelihoods, So if we could create some sort of animal that is just stable in most conditions and is not susceptible to a lot of these diseases that you're speaking of, I feel like that's like a next logical endpoint for genetics, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no, I would agree. Yeah, I think horses are a good sort of place where you could potentially test some of that, because they're, it's for certainly in our country, right? We're not going to eat them,
Mm-hmm.
for the most part. The limitation of genetic editing and things like that in cattle and other sort of agricultural species like that is that it's, you are going to have, and there's probably some really good logic behind it. You're going to have people who are worried about eating, a genetically modified cow.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we did this, we already have that, and there's been some logical, reasons for that. I remember there was a BT corn, which had a gene inserted into it to help with pest resistance. It had, caused sort of an allergic reaction in certain people, right? So there's, these sort of off effects that we're not, aware of. So
Accounting for,
it
yeah.
needs people to be, a little bit concerned about those in their diets and whatnot. Um, you know, Horses would be, for the most part, not, under that. I think, and I think as long as you don't start with performance enhancing modifications, there's a way to sort of look at that and, can we improve the welfare of our animals by making some of these changes? That'd be a valuable place to start. You know, that's I always think it's funny too. You're talking science fiction. Star Trek's a big influence in my,
Mm-hmm.
bringing in sort of, formative experiences, and that's actually one of those things that it ends up being a little bit of a back and forth because we can do all of these things. One of the
Mm-hmm.
messages of Star Trek, and one of my favorite characters was always Geordi, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and Geordi exemplified a reason to not necessarily eliminate all negative, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A
Yeah.
lot of his a lot
Blind.
of his strength and insight came from the fact that he saw differently,
Yeah,
which
that's
was
fair.
kind of right. But I think, like they said, there's there's a path to follow, right? It's not maybe absolute, you know fixing everything, but there are certain things that, and it might have been before we started recording the brief conversation, talked about like changing thing, eliminating sickle cell.
Mm-hmm.
That might not be a terrible,
Yeah,
and
I don't think that that's a
that might
bad
not
thing.
be a terrible thing. Or taking, really productive and efficient, cattle from the United States and using some of that tool to modify them so that they can go to more tropical and right. Can we improve the efficiency of these production systems by making changes? And
Yeah,
that more, we reduce methane production from cattle. We produce, make feed efficiency higher so that we can still produce, you
yeah,
know, for people all over the world, but continue to reduce the environmental impact of producing that. Can we make, horse, horse systems more efficient? Like, can we make horses more adaptable to live close, better lives in more urban environments so that, people in Boston get to, interact with,
yeah. Yeah,
the,
no, that's a vision of the future that I guess number one, I didn't really think about so much, but also, it's something that I would want to subscribe to, which is a really awesome view, and I really appreciate that. And I love Star Trek a lot too. I feel like that's like the best vision, the best utopian vision for our future. Like we're a post-scarcity society, money is not really a thing anymore, and every human being is just able to live and to maximize their own potential. Like that's something that's really, I think, important to have as like a setting, a bar that's set so that everybody can achieve. But thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate it. We are getting close to our time. Before I get into our three questions, I do want to ask you, just out of pure curiosity, you grew up around horses, like your father researched them as well. What is your favorite horse sport? Are you like more like a racing guy, or like you said you were the polo advisor? Like, do you like that game, or what for somebody like me who's just a beginner into this, what's a good introductory sport?
well, I'm going to be entirely biased now and tell you that it's polo. Uh,
Yeah.
I was introduced to polo very late.
Hmm.
So it's, I don't know that there was a really good reason that I became the polo advisor other
Hmm.
than,
You're the horse guy. Yeah.
need and availability. And you know, my experience with horses was my dad was an extension
Hmm.
uh, professional. So he when we lived in Canada, he went around to farms and sort of, they'd have questions, or, they'd be like, they'd ask about things. And so, that was my experience to go with them. I was always trying to steal part of the salt block from the horses. That was sort of my purpose in life when I was, 6, 7, or 8 years old. But no, polo is an amazing sport, and like I said, I'm 100% biased towards it now. It was this thing I didn't realize that I needed in my life. But it's like hockey and NASCAR smushed.
Yeah.
It's the most sort of high intensity, but just wild. And when they play it, when they play it well, it's just one of the most beautiful,
Yeah. I need to get into it. My wife is from Afghanistan, and so they play this game called Buzkashi there, where they it's kind of like polo, but it involves a goat carcass or something like that.
I'm familiar with it. Yeah, that is potentially one of the sort of the origin story of polo may have come from that, but it really gained prominence. It's called the sport of kings, which makes it a little bit exclusive, and that can be unfortunate. But it was a way for the British military and a lot of militaries to train their cavalry.
Yeah, interesting. Have you seen the I know you're from Colorado, so the Denver Nuggets Jokic, he has this chariot game. What is that about? I've never is that a Eastern European thing, or I just did a deep dive into horse sports before we found you as a podcast
I'm
guest.
unfamiliar with that. I'm unfamiliar with exactly what it does with his horses. He's a great story though, because that's he's so good at his chosen profession, and it sort of seems like it's
it's like a hobby.
It's not his primary focus, which is kind of brilliant.
I know he's an amazing player. I look at him as he's like us, right? You go to your job, and there's people that are all about their job. I feel like I'm one of those people, and there's people that are just I'm here, I'm gonna work, but my real passion is my family or whatever. His real passion is horses, he goes to work and he goes home and he enjoys himself at home, I think, more than on the basketball court. But
there's a meme, and it probably might have fit to him. Said I work hard so my horses can have a better life.
Exactly right.
No, yeah, the polo is great. I think if you can get in, there's a lot of really great polo up in the sort of Northeast.
Yeah, I'll check it out. I mean, it's just not. I've been introduced to this world just by this one news article, and it's really been illuminating. It's interesting to speak to somebody like you that's been in this world almost their entire life, and it's just something that I didn't know. That I really just enjoy finding out about cultures that I didn't know existed before, and horse culture is something that is just so deep. I mean, it's literally been around for millennia, right? And so
all of this, I like to point out to my students. So we at the end of so one of my classes is equine genetics, and the last bit we sort of talk about evolution of the horse and whatever. And I think it's really important. There's been some very, very successful and well-developed societies, right? Aztecs, the Pueblo, Anasazi, all of those, right? We can see the remains of those cultures, but they're all, past cultures. And one of the defining, and I don't know if it's absolute, but these cultures that have, risen to prominence and then sort of fallen away, one unifying factor is that they didn't have horses integrated into their culture. And all of the cultures that have sort of sustained and gone on have had horses involved. So I think for me, it speaks to an importance of what they can provide for us. And it changes over time. A big thing that CSU leads really well on is something that's now called equine assisted services, right? So using horses to better the lives of people, right? So, we have, physical therapy associated with horses, mental therapy associated with horses. It can be a really useful application to help, and to be useful for veterans after they're, completed their service and whatever. And so, that would be a place, I think, where a lot of these, what we talked about, especially genetic, could we produce perfect therapy horse.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that the relationship between human beings and horses is something that was really illuminating in this whole deep dive that I've done. I mean, it's an animal that we don't really use for food, that has this entirely work-oriented application in our society, not like dogs, which are like our friend, or livestock obviously that we eat. It's its own thing, and I really appreciated learning about it. But we're getting to the end of our time now. I really appreciate having you on, Stephen. Let's talk about the three questions that I ask all my guests. Number one, obviously we talked about science fiction. It's a big motivating factor for me. What motivates you? What gets you excited about the future?
I I would say two things. I got into this and I continue to be, the thing that motivates me is I want to understand why things work the way they work. You know, I want to know why things are. The other part that motivates me, and this is a surprise to me in my life because it was not something that when I was a graduate student or in training that I thought was going to be a part of it. Um, Working, the teaching part of my job is probably one of the most rewarding parts of my job, and that I get to do that in a formal setting in the classroom, and I like to believe that I'm giving them an experience that they don't get in other classes. But I might be kind of a revolutionary from a teaching perspective. But even that's the part about polo I don't think I knew that I needed, is that, right, the teaching, the sort of interaction with the students just on that level, and helping them, hopefully helping them
Right.
be the best versions of themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I totally agree. I teach the residents at Tufts University, and it's so motivating. It keeps you young for sure, but also it's super motivating. I really appreciate that. So this is called the Futurist Society, and I want to know, where do you see horses and our interaction with the animal in 20 years, 10, 20 years? Like, what do you see coming out of all of these scientific breakthroughs that are happening?
I hope that we can use, right, so horses have, right, enrich a whole bunch, whole host of parts of our lives, right? There's, it's enormous fun to go watch them race. It's fun to go to a rodeo and see, the skill there. It's fun to watch a polo match and see, that display. It's awesome to just go hang out with them and to be able to interact with them, and, the therapy side of all of those things. We're at a bit of a crossroads where, racing is exciting to watch, but it also has the, right, sometimes horses get hurt, sometimes the athletes get hurt.
Yeah.
There's questions about, are we doing the best for our animals? And, horses that are in a weird place is that we have the people who sort of do the horse stuff. And like you said, there's a whole aspect of society that love horses, interact with horses, want horses to be there, but are unsure about the management, the production side
Yeah.
of, and I think we're in a position with all of the scientific breakthroughs and scientific insight that we can provide, where we can hopefully help to bridge that, right? So we can say we are doing the best. This is why we're doing the best, and we can demonstrate that, and so we can, you know, with that into the future, we can solidify a place for horses in society
Mhm.
similar to what they have now, right? Where we benefit from them as a society, but we know that we're doing the best we can for them.
Yeah, like the analysis of data to create best practices for horses. I totally agree. I think that that's something that we have for humans. We don't have that for animals, at least that I can think of, you know?
We have a lot of opinions on what it is.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
if
Can I tell
science,
you what I hope happens? I really have a lot of hope in man to animal communication. The cetaceans, I think, are going to be like whales and stuff are going to be first. There's like a really big investment in AI analysis of how they communicate with each other, and they've made a lot of progress. I was listening to a Joe Rogan podcast on artificial intelligence, and the two guys that were basically saying a lot of, negative aspects of artificial intelligence. That's their side job, right? They're activists to promote some sort of oversight for artificial intelligence, but their day job is they're working for, this whale communication project. And I thought it was so interesting. And, it's something that I looked into, and they're making progress. I think that's something that would be interesting. But the ability to communicate with our dogs, the ability to communicate with our animals like horses and that stuff, I think that's going to be a really fun future to live in.
It'd be really exciting to, I think, understand the communication with our animals, because that's one of the, like you were saying that with my dog, like there's very clearly communication between me and my dog.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I don't know that either one, right? Either my dog or me really appreciate the full, right?
Right.
It might
Right.
be that we get the point communicated
Yeah.
by intent, but by
Yeah. 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 Do you have kids at all?
I have two kids, yeah.
Yeah. So I look at like you're interacting with like a toddler versus like interacting with, a 9-year-old. Totally different experience. And I think that I feel like right now human to animal interaction is similar to like how you're talking to a baby. Like there's some sort of understanding there, but it's not as much as you would like, right?
It's very, if you horses, I think, right, good example of that. If you watch people, right, people who really get a lot out of their animals in terms of like, watch somebody, polo players, the people who like just have that like
Intuitive
whatever,
sense.
right? Like I think there are people who have achieved that, like they're working with their partner, right? It's like a partner, not a
Absolutely.
and that would be cool, right? Well, I mean, how that would be amazing in terms of how we would interact with them, right? We would know more about how to address their needs, how to do that. The one
Yeah.
with the cetaceans, the whales, they might need a Vulcan, but
I hope so. Okay, so last question. It's something that I just want to zoom out for a bit. Like, so let's not talk about horses. Let's talk about Stephen Coleman, the molecular biologist. What scientific breakthroughs are really exciting you right now that are coming down the pipeline? Like outside of your field, what is something that you just can't learn enough about? Like you're just so excited about independently as a hobby?
uh my right sequence, the amount of data that we can generate
Yeah.
is just phenomenal.
Yeah.
And it's a little overwhelming some days, but it's also really exciting because there's no lack of questions, right? It's like there's always, that may even be a problem for me, right? I need to finish, something that I started, but there's, three other questions. You're like, oh, this would be really cool to ask. This would be really cool to ask. This would be really cool to ask. You know, we it's come up a couple of times like AI,
Hmm.
especially from the, education side of things. There's a lot of, apprehension about it. They're like, well, how are we going to teach writing and when a computer can write it now? And I it's fun to play around with that and just sort of tinker with it. But it's also, as a fan of Star Trek from, the 80s,
Hmm.
I joke and say I've been waiting for AI to catch up to this point.
I know. Me
80s.
too. Yeah.
Like all of these things, all of this busy work that we could now, like
Yes.
we're
Yeah.
close to being what computers were supposed to be, which is to make our lives
Easier. Yeah.
so we can focus on, right, rather than being like, oh, you have to write this report. Now you can go focus on and be like, what does that report mean? What is
Right.
how are we going to apply that? How are we going to make things better?
Yeah.
Because we didn't have to do all of the busy work. It requires a shift to some of what we talked about, right? Like
Yeah.
no scarcity, like we can focus on being better, not doing all of the things that we've decided are important.
Yeah. I can't wait for my own personal assistant that takes care of all the admin work of 2024, right? Like just paying bills, redoing my license and registration, just like all of this extra stuff that just like takes away from experiencing the things that I want to experience. But I would take it a step further in that my thing that I'm looking most forward to is automated robots that allow us to, or that do the chores that we don't want to do, like watering plants, folding laundry. That's going to be amazing. I can't wait until that happens.
The robot that gets the laundry from the dryer to the dresser, that's going to be revolutionary.
Yeah. And those robots could brush a horse, or like make sure that its mane is nice and well kept. Like I think that's going to be an amazing experience for everybody. But man, thank you so much for speaking with us. I really appreciate having you on. I'm sure our audience is now enlightened a little bit more to this part of the field of science that they may not have been exposed to otherwise. And for everybody out there in the audience, as always, please like and subscribe, and we will see you again in the future. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
Actually, it's been great.
We appreciate you taking part in today's episode. Take this chance to reimagine a better future by joining a community of futurists who strive for a remarkable world. Be a part of this growing network and contribute to making the world a more positive place. Visit thefuturistsociety.net and subscribe to the show so you don't miss a drop of hopeful futurism.